Hello and welcome to our first episode of Rethinking Trauma and Transition. And I'd like you to introduce to Ali. Ali, can you tell us a bit about yourself and what you do and your background, please?
Yeah, thanks, Rich. So my name's Ali. I work as a hypnotherapist, a life coach, and my areas of specialism are very much to do with trauma recovery, and narcissistic abuse. And as part and parcel of that, then I also have worked extensively with veterans, working particularly with PTSD and CPTSD. What about you, Rich? Why don't you tell us a bit about your background too?
So I'm ex-forces, served approximately 20 years in the army, and I teach people self-defense and conflict management, and I'm also a volunteer therapist with Icarus, and I do my own therapy, private therapy as well. So there we go.
Fantastic. So probably a good idea if we share with everybody what we actually want to talk about and what we want to do with this podcast. What do you reckon?
I reckon that'd be a good idea, given a brief overview as to what we're doing, what we're looking at getting out of this, and how we can possibly help you with post-traumatic stress or trauma, and then re-identification through the transition, possibly out of the military or later on when you have into civilian life.
Yeah, and I think that's quite a wide topic, because that's there not only for that civilian military transfer, but applies probably to a lot of people when there's major shifts and changes in their life experiences, whether that's a change of career, change of relationship, change of location. All of these are transitions, and sometimes those are things that have a much bigger impact on us than we expect.
Yeah, would you say that would be to do with people's and how they identify with themselves and maybe the spaces that are around them?
I would think that's a massive component of that, because for most of us, we have an internal image of ourselves, and that internal image is made up of the different components of our lives, and a big part of that is quite often about our career, our location, and the community around about us. So I mean, if you look at, for instance, I mean, how many times, Rich, do you meet somebody and when they introduce themselves, they give you their name, but they also give you their job?
Yeah, quite a lot. People don't say, oh, I'm a really generous person or I am an avid book reader. It's because I think it's got a lot to do with status and where we want to put ourselves in maybe a hierarchy.
Well, I think also it's also sometimes to do with the sheer split of time that we have.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if you think about it, most people will work full time. That means that on average, the full time hours is between 35 to 40 hours a week. And when you build in commute time on top of that, that means that actually the bulk of your wide awake time is spent in the work environment, not actually in your private setting. And that means that for a lot of people, what they do for a living has a huge impact on how they identify. And a lot of that is about sense of purpose, and what their goals are and what they want to achieve. So there's that sense of purpose in there, which again has a massive impact in terms of that transition for those moving from military to civilian.
Definitely, yeah. And it's that close-knit community that we have in the military as well. So we're very deeply associated with each other and those organizations and those structures. And also it's kind of that our day is planned out as well. Whereas when we do leave the military, it's kind of like, oh, what's going on now? What do I do next?
So would you say it's safe to say that in terms of career paths, the military is one of those careers that you would almost class as a way of life rather than just a job?
Yeah, for some people, it's definitely a way of life. There's a lot of people who read the comic books, maybe reading all these war stories, etc. And that's all they ever want to do is join forces in whatever position that is, because from such a young age, maybe they wanted to identify as being in the army, navy, air force, whatever it is.
Do you think a lot of that is to do with the nature of how the military is set up? And I know we're going to talk about that extensively in one of our later episodes when we really explore that concept of identity. But there is that sense where when you join the military, you join a community because of the nature of how, for instance, the military is set up. You know, how you're put into barracks, where your quarters, your social experiences, all of that is all encompassed within that whole ethos.
Yeah, and we are also quite, in some ways, quite isolated from the general civilian population, because pretty much everything can be contained within the camp. All our working structures, obviously, things like shopping, yeah, we do have to go out and go to the big shops and wherever else to do all that sort of stuff. But generally, everything is contained within that camp, within that unit. And then going away on tour, go on exercises, we're all there together, working together in some capacity.
And that makes that quite an unusual experience in terms of a job and identity and career. And that, I suppose, that's where I would say it's almost like a way of life rather than
yeah,
choice.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Yeah.
There's some people who are more into it than others, I would say, as well.
I think that's always the case, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So what else are we going to talk about over the next couple of episodes that people might be interested in?
So I think, what do you think people think that trauma is, Ali? Can you give us an overview of that, please?
Well, I think that's a massive topic in its own right. And I think
in fact, I'll refine that question a bit better. Is post-traumatic stress, is it a disorder? Is it an injury? And what are the common perceptions of people with that you've come across so far?
Well, I think there's a growing use of the term trauma, PTSD, whether it's PTSD or PTSI, although PTSI is used less commonly. And it's almost become part of everyday speech.
Can you explain to listeners what the PTSI is for those who don't know?
I can. So PTSD stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSI, however, is a slightly different take in that it refers to the experiences of the individuals as an injury rather than a disorder. And there's quite a different ethos in terms of the thinking around that, which we'll explore at length, because I think it's a debate worth having.
Definitely.
In terms of, is this a disorder or is it an injury? And I know certainly I have very, very specific views on that, and I'm sure that's going to be an interesting conversation.
Yeah.
But coming back to that idea of what the common idea or an understanding is of trauma, you hear people every day talking about, I'm traumatized because of the length of the queue, or they'll talk about the fact that they're feeling a little PTSD-ish. And it's such a misuse of the phrasing and the experience, because it minimizes the impact that it has on lives.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that hopefully people will have a better understanding of when we have that conversation, because post-traumatic stress is not something that we would want. It's not something that you would take lightly, and it has a huge impact not only on the individual's experience, but those that live with them and their friends with them, their connections with them, and it can really have a massive detrimental impact on every aspect of their life, and it isn't something we should take lightly.
Definitely, yeah. So my view of post-traumatic stress, things like is you've got the extreme end of things, where if you watch the old First World War footage of people in recovery hospitals, all these men, and their bodies can't function properly. So you've got that one extreme of things, and on the other end of things is people who are functioning normally in society, they're just managing to cope. And when they hear about somebody else's event, they go, oh, I didn't experience something as bad as that. And so they begin to minimize their own experience instead of going, that's my experience, this is what happened to me, and it doesn't matter what happens to other people. So people end up in like maybe trauma Olympics. So, oh yeah, I got I experienced X, Y, and Z, and all this was happening, and that was happening, whereas somebody else just maybe Well, I don't know, fell off a bike.
Don't you think that part and parcel of that then is very much related to us understanding that it's not necessarily about the size of the event, it's the size of the response?
Yeah.
And a lot of that, you know, is rightly said, is that people find it difficult enough to talk about their experiences without that fear of it not being sufficiently difficult or sufficiently horrific an experience for them to merit it, when that's not the case.
Yeah, absolutely.
On you now.
People have probably got their own judgments on what they think they should be suffering from and how to suffer.
Well, I think the other thing is that it's not necessarily always something that happens to you. You can have a post-traumatic stress response from experiencing, witnessing, or even hearing about something that's happened to someone else.
Yeah. So that'd be kind of like a secondary post-traumatic stress. So people who read a lot of police statements from or watching these victims of indecent children images, they get traumatized through reading that or having to watch that to find out who these perpetrators are, that kind of thing as well.
Yes, that's a very good example. Or, for instance, it could be that maybe you've witnessed your neighbour's house burn down, or you've witnessed somebody who has been attacked or assaulted, or you've witnessed a major accident or even a minor accident, but it's had a profound impact on you, and and that comes back to that sense of it's not necessarily about the event, it's about the impact of the event.
Well, it is never the event, it's always what's happened after the event and how the body copes with, or how the person copes with afterwards.
Well, I think the other thing is what's nice is that sometimes you get an awful lot of jargon in these things, and conversations we're going to be having, we're going to kind of strip it back to basics and give people hopefully a way of understanding and describing their experiences that helps to kind of give you a bit more of understanding of what's actually happening in our heads and our brains when we're having these experiences. Because I don't know about you, but in the work that I do, Rich, and I don't doubt that you're exactly the same, quite often some of the biggest hurdle is actually working with people to give them an understanding of what's happening, what they're experiencing, because they'll have been hit with an awful lot of medical jargon, an awful lot of very correct terminology, but it hasn't actually put it in real terms and to describe them what's actually happening in their head and why.
Yeah, get overwhelmed with too much information, and is what they're being told relevant for them? And could, as you say, that language be simplified? And I think we could also, with this, is touch on, as you kind of briefly did, is tier 1 and tier 2 traumas, or could be, as you said, about houses being burnt down, which people can generally cope with better psychologically. And then tier 2 trauma, which is the experience of the other.
Yeah. So there's a lot for us to go in there, and I dare say that's probably going to be split over a couple of episodes, but it should be a really interesting conversation.
Yeah.
I think the other thing that we'll start to explore, and again start to put into real language and real terms, is that experience of anxiety, because it's highly prevalent within our society today, but it's also something that's a key component of that post-traumatic stress response. And again,
and I think also the conversation can go as well is talking about grief and these other symptoms that surround post-traumatic stress. They can appear to be post-traumatic stress, but it might be grief, it might be anxiety instead. And so finding out what that really is as well.
Well, I think the other thing is also starting to put these in, so that they can often be component parts of that post-traumatic stress as well. And there are layers to that, which hopefully we'll unpick over the next few years. That will help people in terms of their understanding of what that is. So I think that means that there's going to be probably a lot of discussion about that transition piece. So that we've certainly been having some interesting conversations in terms of collecting some of that information about what's going on. And I think there should be some really interesting conversations come out in terms of what that transition actually looks like, in terms of resources, in terms of experiences. See if we can do a bit of a global perspective on that.
Absolutely. And all going well, we'll have some really good guests to widen this discussion for our listeners.
Yeah, and I'm very hopeful in that. So hold on, this could get to be a really interesting debate.
Definitely.
Certainly the ones that I'm really looking forward to are when we start to unpick that challenge about identity and start to look at what actually forms that, because the part there is that some of our I am statements and where those come from. I think that's going to be a really interesting conversation too.
Yeah, definitely. As you mentioned previously, the big I am, and who am I, and who do I want to be after I leave this career? Because everybody has to leave the military at some point, whether it's day one of basic training or some people would be after 22 years or whatever it is now from that final day of signing off.
Yeah, and I think that comes back to that sense of purpose and sense of identity again.
Yeah.
And starting to clear out some of our inner beliefs and where our beliefs are formed and how they're formed, and actually how many of those actually are ours.
Yeah. So we could potentially pick up on as well is logical levels of Robert Dilts' fame. Yeah.
Yeah. You know, I'm very fond of that. So yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, and start to look at the importance of language, because I know both are heavily into language and what that means. You know, the how we describe and define our world and our experiences, and the impact that can have on us just from the words we choose to use from that.
Definitely.
You know, I've got a major passion in terms of metaphor, and we describe our worlds using descriptive terms because we have no other way to contextualize it and build that experience or convey that experience. It can tell us so much.
Yeah, well, my understanding, Ali, is we make up a metaphor every 6 minutes. And I know you probably do even more than that.
Probably, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think the other thing that we're going to have a look at is an understanding of actually what is the military mindset. And that's going to be key in terms of that whole conversation about identity, about purpose. And that's going to be central to all of that as well. Because I think sometimes there's a lack of understanding of actually what the experience is within the military and what that thinking pattern actually means and what that results in terms of beliefs, behaviors, and responses to that.
Yeah, and so that can cover things like setting boundaries.
Very much.
Because sometimes in the military, boundaries do get very much blurred. And on one end, that is somebody sacrificing themselves to save other people's lives. That's the extreme end of things, obviously. And then there's the other thing of being in camp doing, I can do this, I can do that, just to get a job done.
Well, you know, I'm very hot in that conversation about boundaries, and that's a conversation I have time and time again with people, because, and again, it's very strongly linked to that concept of military mindset and the way of thinking, which in a military setting works extremely well, but it doesn't translate as well into civilian life. And I think that's again part of the challenge within the transition.
Yeah,
is how you kind of bridge that gap and understanding the difference between the military life, which can be very black and white, where what's said is meant, that's very clear in terms of your objectives, how that's going to be carried out, what the outcome's going to look like, and the timescales to deliver that. And all of a sudden you find yourself in the civilian world that is all shades of grey, where none of that's clear, and the level of ambiguity is way higher than you're used to. And that can mess with your thinking, big stuff.
No, absolutely. An example of not setting boundaries for themselves is a friend of mine was in the training wing, and he had a year left before he got out. He basically didn't do any transition, didn't do any pre-programming for what he wanted to do when he left. He didn't look for housing, he didn't do this, and he didn't do that and the other. He basically worked in the training wing, and then, Christ, where am I? I haven't got anything. Unfortunately for him, they allowed to stay in for accommodation and bits and pieces, when he really could have been saying, no, I have to get my own stuff done, and the training wing is irrelevant for me now. Well, I think when he had to do his job, obviously when his duties were needed, then they were needed, but ultimately he had to look after himself, but he didn't. Well,
if I look back to previous careers, I used to work in HR extensively, and when we were going through and managing through, for instance, redundancy programs, a big part of that was what we would class as the outplacement program. Now, the outplacement programs that I put in place were slightly different, because it wasn't just about learning to write your CV and job interview skills and job search skills. Actually, a lot of that was about identity. A lot of that was addressing the fact that the people that were now faced with these career changes may have done that job for the last 15, 20 years. They might never have gone for a job interview before. And actually, the experience of the working environment outside the boundaries of that organisation would be extremely different. And dealing with the impact emotionally and the grieving process of such a huge change. Because grief isn't just about death. Grief is about loss. And that loss can be identity, community, purpose, any of those.
It could be it's a metaphorical death, isn't it?
Yeah.
Not an actual living death.
It's the loss of something.
And
it's that grief is often part and parcel of that transition issue that's experienced in that movement from military to civilian.
Yeah. I was going to have something in there, but I can't remember what it is now, so I couldn't be relevant.
I doubt it, but it's probably going to come back to you later.
Possibly, yeah, after we just finish up here then.
So, is it worth saying that there'll also be an opportunity for people to kind of give us ideas themselves if there's something that they want us to either look at, talk about, because hopefully there'll be quite a few of these conversations to come.
Definitely.
Or something that we've maybe talked about today that are particularly interested in.
Yeah. Email address is alirich at Rethinking Trauma and Transition.com. Yeah. So you can email us. So we'll put this in the show notes anyway. So so have to remember all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
And that way, if there's any questions, you can either put it in the comments or whatever podcast platform you're listening or watching this on, or you can email us direct, but that'll be in the...
Absolutely. And we'll set up a Facebook group as well if you're interested in joining that at some point.
And that way, if there's any polls you want to, we can maybe put a couple of polls later on and see if there's any particular topics that people want to get a bit more about. And who knows, if there's enough interest, might choose to do a deep dive into one of these topics as well.
Definitely, yeah. I say thank you very much for listening, and it's a good night from me.
And good night from me.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.